Alrighty, good evening again. This is Jonathan Albin. This is NycosRPG. And tonight on Creative Differences, we're going to be recreating the episode I did this morning because somebody, the guy with two thumbs, accidentally somehow left the audio track off. And so we didn't have any sound. So those of you that attempted to watch it, I thank you very much for being so heroic. Ironically, we had twice as many views as possible. I think that's because people expected me to re-record, and I didn't even notice until this afternoon that that was the case. So we are going to attempt to recreate the tale that I told this afternoon. And the concept here is we're looking at what is a persona, what is a character, how the character attributes in particular were derived, and how they have therefore adapted or morphed into the current use of them in the NycosRPG. So we're going to start off by talking about how they originally came to be, where they originally came from, and all of that. So if you're really interested in this, make sure that you follow this channel so you can keep up on all the videos that we do. And by following the channel, and in particular, if you can't subscribe to the channel, you'll be given updates whenever we do new videos and whenever new stuff becomes available. We do also record this onto YouTube, so you'll be able to see this video there as well after its time on Twitch has ended. So, getting started, we're looking at the attributes of Dungeons and Dragons in particular, because that is the granddaddy of them all, and it was the, pardon me, it was the mechanical system under which I learned the game long ago. And so the first thing to talk about is the very concept of persona. As you may recall, we had a talk about this at some time recently about how the role-playing games developed and derived from the board games and war games in particular, and were resolving questions about the groups of individuals that were removed from play in a board game for being broken. And what did that actually mean? What did that entail? And how would you perceive their return to their unit or their origin? And then later, by extension, how would it be if you use that same concept for a group on a more of an odyssey, the concept of returning to their homes after a war and all the adventures they might have on the way. When you talk, therefore, about those units, we have to talk a little bit about how they were recognized or acknowledged on the battlefield in those early days. And so the concept of warfare meant that each unit would be given certain numeric values, which were called attributes. And these attributes generally would be, one would be the strength of a unit in terms of military strength. The second number would be that unit's defensive value. And the third would be its move rate. Those numbers don't really translate well when you're talking about switching up from, say, 1/15th scale to 1/25th scale, and therefore the numbers being kind of crunchy led to the decision to make those numbers have other meanings. And I think you will see how these numbers that we see came to be from those earlier values. Pardon me, I have something to. So let's talk first of all about the construction of the number set. The order that I've placed on the screen here was the original order for characters in Dungeons and Dragons, and it's maintained this structure and this order all the way through Dungeons and Dragons into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, then back to Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition, and then finally in 3rd edition they adjusted these. So this structure I'm talking about specifically applied to those early numbers, and they were derivatives of the numbers I mentioned before. The idea, therefore, of a unit's strength was referring to its military capacity, what it could accomplish in terms of its military strength. So, for example, heavy cavalry would be assigned a larger strength value than, say, light cavalry, as just a sheer one-to-one example. The idea of a unit's strength, therefore, was determining how likely it was to hit an opponent, how likely it was to damage an opponent. And secondary value would be the defensive value of that same unit. And so, for example, a heavy cavalry might have a fairly decent defense because the heavy cavalry also had to be able to resolve against phalanxes and formation units and such. And so to show their effectiveness in battle, they would have to have a fairly high defense value so that the concept of the initial charge more than likely wouldn't necessarily break a unit of that kind of magnitude, whereas a light cavalry charging up against an infantry might not fare as well. This concept of strength, ironically being placed as the primary attribute in a role-playing character, kind of is an interesting choice. It has, I believe, everything to do with the concept that right from the beginning, Dungeons and Dragons was a war fighting or a combat fighting game. It was not, when they say a role-playing game, it really wasn't truly the concept of playing a role. Instead, you were looking at the general relative values, and you were trying to come up with a numeric value that would represent the basic types of units that they perceived being played in the game. Therefore, the order of these numbers has everything to do with what they perceive to be the primary class structure. And I didn't talk about that as much in the original version of this video, so I think I'll do a heck of a lot better in this version by actually referring to that and talking through that in particular. The idea, therefore, is that you have to look at the concept of the units they were trying to build. The concepts were, of course, the idea of a warrior, a wizard, a holy man or cleric, and a rogue or thief. This mechanism of having 4 different types of units is indicated by the 4 primary attributes: strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity. And we'll go into these in much more detail, but the point here is that having one attribute for each of them gave a way to be able to determine from your initial dice roll for each of these attributes what kind of a persona this character that you were building would be optimal for playing. Now, this original concept was, I think, in some ways similar to the original concepts in the game of Magic the Gathering, which occurred much, much later. And that was, the idea was, cards were so inexpensive to produce at the time, you could actually build a deck, and as the monsters were destroyed, you could actually destroy the cards in the deck because this person could simply go out and buy more of them. Now, that concept is completely abhorrent to collectors of cards now and is appalling to most designers, but to look back at the production cost of a deck of cards back in those days and realize numerically what we're talking about, it was less than 19 cents a deck to produce a deck of cards, 52 cards. So if you had a deck of 60 cards, you might go up to, say, 20, 25 cents. And therefore, the idea of buying a deck of cards and frittering it away in the case of an event night was perfectly feasible, because that's what happened even in games of poker. You played with a deck for a few hands, and then that deck was worn, was kind of used, and then, yeah, you'd keep it around for your kids to play cards with, but they were no longer the pristine, quote, good cards, and so therefore they would just be processed out. Well, as we know today, that would never be the case. The Magic the Gathering cards gained intrinsic value just by being printed and being in existence, so that they lost that ability to be disposable. And the same thing was true in the characters, and we'll get more into that because that starts to explain why the numbers are the way they are and how their use evolved over time. So, therefore, when we look at the value of strength, we're looking at physically what the unit's abilities will be in combat. Now, realize that the creation of these numbers, according to the rule system of Dungeons and Dragons at the time, was to roll 3 6-sided dice, add them together, and that numeric value would be your strength. Then you pick up the same 3 dice, roll again, and the outcome of that die roll would become intelligence, then wisdom, then dexterity, constitution, and charisma. This mechanism, 3d6, was a bell curve, with the majority of die rolls being somewhere in the middle of the curve, and the extremes, both high and low, being increasingly less likely. So the concept of rolling a 3 or an 18 were both astronomically different than perhaps the middle of that. So 3 times 3.5 around 10. So a 10 was a nominal value, and a 3 or an 18 would be an extreme value. And because of the fact that the dice mechanism here is to define the persona, define the character, by rolling them straight and rolling and keeping the values for each one, your character would run the gamut of being either particularly strong, perhaps particularly intelligent, particularly wise, particularly dexterous, and so on. But on a given persona, you would have a majority of those dice rolls fall right on the 10 or thereabouts. And so out of 6 die rolls, you would have 4 of them that would be somewhere between 9 and 11, and you'd have 1 or 2 that would be above that and 1 or 2 that were below that mathematically. Which is all well and good. But just as the magic cards became valuable once you started to play them, these numbers became increasingly valuable once you began to play them, so that a persona that was going to be played by a player, would want to have a high strength, if he was going to be a warrior, a high intelligence, if he's going to be a spellcaster, a high wisdom for the holy man. And we'll go into these individually in a moment, but the whole point is that once you have this, then every one of the primary classes would have a primary attribute, so that when you rolled, you could look at the numbers and decide fundamentally which one of them would be optimal for the dice that you rolled. Of course, it didn't take long to realize that these numbers were, while adequate for play, were not nearly as fun as the numbers with modifiers would be. And so it didn't take long till players weren't just rolling a single character in order, but were rolling, say, 6 characters at a time, having a 36-point grid, and then choosing which row across, which row diagonally, which row up and down came up with the best number sequence for a character. So instead of having a pick of 1 of 1, you were getting a pick of 1 of 36, or maybe 3 out of 36. But the point is that you would be optimizing the die rolls. Now, before we go into the numbers any further, let's look at these individual values. I mentioned strength. Strength would be one-to-one comparison with the war games. You want the fighting capability to be easily defined by a single number, and so therefore your strength would be defining physically what your persona would be able to do in combat. When you go to this number 2 tier, this one's interesting because you have to consider what intelligence really means and define it narrowly to make it so that it fits the idea of a spellcaster or a wizard. And in particular, what they looked at was the intellect as memorization. So this intellect value would give you how many points of memorization skill you might have, and so therefore it would grant you, for example, on a higher level, if you have a higher number, 17, 18, or whatever, you would get additional spell slots, additional memorization slots to use. Now, I find this interesting that the intellect is affiliated with magic, which is whimsy and randomness, whereas the concept of wisdom is associated with faithfulness and piety. And I find this fascinating because arguably those who are more savvy in the world statistically are less likely to have a faith component. In other words, if you're going to say that intelligence is making you believe in your magics more, then you're counteracting the very concept. The idea is that an intellect would see. They fundamentally have looked at people and in a sociological sense, and they found that the people who are more aware of the world and more astute tend to be less believers in the world because they tend to believe in their own knowledge, their own wisdom. So the irony is that it seems to be that a person who is wise to themselves tends to be more ignorant of the issues of faithfulness, and so therefore a person who is internally intelligent tends to think of themselves as being as intelligent as they can be, and therefore they would lean towards the mystical nature of things because that's based on themselves, whereas those who have faith are going to be those who have awareness, and therefore that wisdom would give them the capacity to actually endeavor to cause things to happen by their own intellect, or by their own knowledge. And so I think these terms are somewhat backwards, but that's a perceptual thing. The reality is that they determined that intelligence meant book learning and book learning meant magic, which is, again, backwards. You would think the book learning would lead you towards a level of wisdom that would mean that the whimsical, magical would be less likely instead of more likely, but I digress. So the idea is that your intellect is determining your spellcasting capability in the terms of magic, and thereby you are determining the outcome of your magical effects based on intellect, and therefore that was given your secondary positioning because it was argued that your intellect is right behind your strength in terms of values for you as a person. So you'll notice that these become decreasingly useful in terms of effectiveness as a unit. Wisdom did tend to lend itself towards the concept of clergy because they'd be the ones who'd be wise enough to make strategies that take into account their own capabilities in terms of defense and wouldn't depend on the capriciousness of magic. Dexterity, ironically, was something that is heightened importance to a warrior. In this case, is also attributed to a person who is arguably the least militarily useful unit, but it's given speed as a counteraction to that. So in the production, well before we come to the modern times, these attributes, strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, all are really fundamentally focusing on the four types of units they envisioned. The very big, very strong, the less strong but more intelligent, then the less intelligent but more faith-driven, and then finally the lesser than all of them and yet the quickest. And it's almost like they gave dexterity speed to the weakling only to give it the ability to avoid the combat. But I digress, because the irony is when we talk about armor, and we talked about a little bit the other day, the concept of armor and speed being equivalent is somewhat ludicrous. But we'll get into that in another conversation. So now we have to switch in a little bit and talk about the defense value of your units. The concept here of constitution, which in Dungeons and Dragons equated to a increase of your hit points, increase of your defensive survivability, was itself kind of a way of trying to mitigate the very, very clear mention of the other 4 attributes in terms of your potency as a combat unit, and this was now talking about your resiliency, and so a higher constitution gave you the opportunity to withstand more damage. Now, it was the same modifier regardless of the class that you were playing. So a warrior got the same modifier to his armor, his hit points, as a rogue, but of course a rogue starts with a much smaller number of hit points to begin with. Both of these values, both of the rogues and the warrior's constitution values being the same, only creates a bit of a buffer in terms of how long the unit can survive before it is eliminated. And so when you are looking, therefore, at the values of these numbers, that constitution modifier doesn't have a class identifier, so it doesn't really modify the class that you're playing, but it does represent a modification to the potential damage you can withstand. Now, the other part of that equation, of course, is armor class, and we will talk about the THACO and armor class in particular in another video where we talk about the merits of armor and what it actually does. But in this case, realize that that constitution modifier is just a delay in the amount of damage that a person can take before they are removed, because that's already been determined by the class structure. A person who is in a warrior class has more survivability than a person in any of the other classes, and in particularly more than the wizard or the rogue. The last attribute that was actually on the character sheet in Dungeons & Dragons was charisma. Now, I included the 7th one because of a later release, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the idea of charisma was to represent how well this unit, whichever class you were, could relate to others, and therefore a charisma that gave you a modifier made it you less inclined to be attacked on the spot and more inclined to be listened to when you are negotiating. And it did not discriminate on where that charisma came from. It was not saying that you're particularly astute or wise. It wasn't saying that you were particularly attractive or beautiful, but it didn't take long for players to equate charisma with beauty. As a matter of fact, that eventually evolved into the current different difficulties with bards, and we will talk about that more in a minute. But the idea that the charisma score would affect your ability to communicate with others also is not class specific. It's not improved if you're a warrior or weakened because you're a wizard. This numeric adapter for charisma was explicitly created so that the dump stat, I guess, would have a reason to have value. Now, when we talk about a being's race, and we will talk about that in another video, probably tomorrow, or no, it'll probably be on Wednesday, Friends Day. The concept of hit points, I think we've already covered earlier in the video, and that is the idea that the hit point pool is a way to mitigate the very concept of unit versus unit combat to make it more equitable. But the charisma modifier, because it only affects the interaction between, say, players and villains in a non-combat situation for the most part, it doesn't have the gravitas that the others would, because the modifier, although it's the same numerically, doesn't have that much of an impact on the conflict. Now, the reason why I included comeliness factor is that comeliness was created in the era of the 2nd edition, and in the favor of dividing charisma from attractiveness. And that was in part because there were a considerable number of players who were female and had somewhat objected to the fact that charisma could also be intimidation or manipulation as compared with sheer attractiveness, and there really wasn't a number that would reflect that feel of beauty. And so by adding the comeliness factor in, I believe it was the Unearthed Arcana book, you provided the players with the ability to have such a attractiveness quotient. Unfortunately, it was not long lived. When second edition became third edition, comeliness vanished again into the ether, so to speak. But there were some players and game masters too, that held onto it afterwards, only because they wanted to have some way of identifying attraction value outside of just the sheer charisma score. So now that we've got these numbers that define the persona in terms of their class modification, let's talk a little bit about how the race factors came into this. Now, we're not going to go into those in particular. We will talk about those in a later video, but the idea of a race modifier was initially only a way to differentiate a player character who was mortal from a player character who was Eldrin. And the modifier was literally there so that you could play out the differences between them, with the understanding that the die rolls weren't being modified per se. Yes, you were adjusting for example, your dexterity as an archer because you were Eldrin, but you were also reducing, say, your constitution because you were more of the fair folk and therefore less likely to be able to withstand damage. And that plus minus give or take only lasted for a few seasons, because by the time D&D second edition came out, players were being told, roll the dice to get your 6 numbers and then place them in any order you want to, and then modify them by your species in any way you want to, up to the rules. And that provided the opportunity for players to start to wish fulfill instead of role play the actual numbers that they created. In other words, you could roll the numbers, adjust where they went to, then modify them again, so that a archer might have been given an 18 as a die roll, but then he chooses the Eldrin species, and the elf species, I'm using the word elf, use the elf species to move them up in a dexterity modifier, so now they've got a 19, which is beyond the physical norm of the game, but therefore that now they have a extra modifier, and therefore the numeric value of the character is now outside of the norms, and that gave it some exclusiveness, some reality. But I hesitate to make that just something that happened. I want to make it clear that the very concept of rolling 3d6 to generate your attributes was by its norm already making your character a superior one to the normals, if you will, the NPCs of the world, which were normally ascribed a 2d6 numeric value. So you were increasing your odds of improving the number and then improving the number on top of that. And then you were moving your attributes. And so what you were fundamentally doing is forward stacking the advances on the persona such that players would be adversely affected if they played a mortal. Human beings with no modifiers by first edition and second edition rules were problematic because nobody would choose to play them because they were not getting the advantages of the other species. Now, second edition did make a poke at this by creating the option of either the human variant, which is really popular now in the third edition, or the concept of giving a modifier to learning speed, or giving them a modifier to all dice rolls. Either which way, they were elevating the NPC, the character being generated, arbitrarily to try to give them back a uniqueness, which ironically they had initially, but you had a lower threshold norm. And that's the bracket creep that we still see in modern Dungeons and Dragons, and that is that each release that comes out whether it be a D&D 5e release or a D&D whatever they're calling this new edition, whether it's 6th edition or the 2024 release of the 2014 book. The advancement creep is still ongoing, and that's because players are not able to see uniqueness because they're not seeing the baseline. The PCs are so numerous now with so many people playing Dungeons and Dragons and people experiencing NPCs that are pre-built in characters, that there is no longer the concept of running into the 12 charisma barkeep, who is the arguably the best looking young lady in town, but that 12 is all she has for charisma because she's a local girl. So she's not a champion, she's not a hero, she's just somebody who lives in a village. And as the line would say, would that you would drink of my lips as deeply, as the young lady was supposed to say in Rocketeer, this person is not supposed to ever be to the level of value that a player character should be, or even a story NPC, and there's more on that when we talk a bit later about Nycos. But the idea, therefore, is that the numeric values were never supposed to be on par with the player characters. The town was supposed to be way inferior. Along come your murder hobos who look at the town and say, oh, a bunch of experience points with no hit points to preserve them and no combat skills to recommend them. Let's just, take them out. And that led to the concept of the personas of characters, the characters themselves being superior. Now, let's add to that the fact that this system, wherein you're choosing where you put your numbers, is already biasing you to be the best at that attribute. But then we add to it the fact that Dungeons and Dragons, in its own mechanic, allowed player characters once every, I think, 4th level or 5th level to increase one of their primary assets. So your strength, your intelligence, wisdom, or whatever could be raised once per so many levels, which skews and biases the very concept of these numbers being primary attributes, because you don't gain intellect by becoming more educated. You become more educated by becoming more educated. You get to have a bigger pool of things to draw upon, but it doesn't make you become smarter. And yet, in this system, using the Dungeons and Dragons methodology, you suddenly get stronger if you want strength, or you get more intelligent, or you get more wise arbitrarily once every X number of levels. And that mechanism provided an opportunity, therefore, for the players to no longer have to see these numbers as their skeleton or as their basis, but simply as another threshold to be bumped. And so, as we went from 3.0 into 5.0, the mechanism for advancement now has been quantified so that players can actually predict a 4 or 5 point bump in their basic attributes in the 20 levels of their adventuring in a role-playing game. And if they stall out that advancement by changing classes, then they give an opportunity for those attributes to increase, even as the skill level doesn't. So it's untenable in terms of creating a realistic game system when you don't hold your NPCs to a core flat level, and you certainly don't keep your PCs to a strict flat level. And so the mechanism for the game is literally unbased and therefore unstable. And in some ways, these are the things that have led to the untenability of Dungeons & Dragons maintaining its course, because players simply don't see the stability they once held. So now we look at these attributes and we now see the order that they put them in: strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, charisma, and comeliness. And the question becomes why, if in later games they compare your physical attributes together and your intelligence together, why in God's Green Earth, why in the world of Dungeons and Dragons does your strength come and then your intelligence, wisdom, and then dex so far down the line, let alone your constitution, which keeps you alive, and your charisma that defines your ability to manipulate the universe? Well, it's really apparent. If you think about it, strength is considered to be most powerful. Intelligence is going to be creating the most magic. Wisdom is going to create the most health, healing. Dexterity is going to give the most speed. And therefore, they were considered higher priority in that order than the idea that they come upon nowadays, where you put your strength, dex, and constitution together as physical attributes, and then your intelligence, wisdom, and charisma as your mental or spiritual attributes. With this mechanism, you have 6 attributes. You have 3d6 you're rolling, or in the case of D&D 3rd edition and beyond, the idea of rolling 4d6 and discarding a value to come up with a much more stable numeric system that you then use to support your class system. And the problem with the class system is we don't work this way. We haven't worked this way in millennia, and the concept of waiting around for your masters to grant you the ability to learn a new skill has been lost. As a matter of fact, in role-playing games today, game masters often are being pleaded with by the players in advance to give experience points or to grant skill bonuses or new feats without the limitations of classes or without the limitations of experience points. And it's for these reasons that the Nikos mechanism gets rid of that altogether and does a completely different process. But the idea here is that when we're looking at the dice rolls for building a persona, if you're looking at these numbers in anything other than a skeletal form and rolling them in the order that they are described, then you are kind of defeating the purpose of the die rolling altogether. And particularly as you get to D&D 4.0 and 5.0, which included the points build system. Now, if you're not familiar with that, it just means that rather than having to roll dice to determine your numeric values, you can pick a flat number for each of the attributes from a threshold list. Once those numbers are chosen, then you can add your racial modifier to it and therefore increase the numeric values of them, and therefore now you have your quote unique character. The challenge with that mechanism is there's no reason to roll the dice, because the rolling mechanism gives you arguably a higher chance of a lower number because of variance. And I'm not going to go into all the particulars of statistics in this episode. We can do that in a later one. But the idea is that the mechanism that lets you choose where you put your numbers completely wipes out the idea that your character is a randomly generated hero within the framework of the norm population, but instead is a specialized persona that fulfills your wish as a player. And that mechanism does lead, therefore, to the idea of the optimizing build, because you look at your numbers and say, well, giving these numbers, then I need to add this attribute, and I need to increase this skill, and then I need to add this new feat. And that mechanism, therefore, makes your character the special one. So, now let me explain what the real difference is between this mechanism and NycosRPG. NycosRPG takes these same numeric values but amalgamates them so that they make more sense. For example, in the concept of your physical prowess, we take the strength and the dexterity and we combine them. We take your intelligence and wisdom and to combine them. We take your dexterity and your constitution and combine them. We take your charisma and your constitution and combine them So we're able to build aggregates of these numbers that make more sense, and they also give a different basis for the persona. Now, if your character has been advanced in a role-play game, such as Dungeons and Dragons, and you use this amalgamation process, you can then add the level of your amalgamation to every skill you have, because it's assumed that the skill basis that you have came from the advancing of your character, and that advancing of character is inversely related. So the idea is that by modifying each of your numbers by that attribute, you now have eliminated the need for leveling any longer, because now, from this point on, each of your attributes will advance, each of your skills, I should say, will advance with their use within a session each time. So, therefore, you've amalgamated into sensible numbers that you can then use as your building block position in Nycos. The Nycos method does not require the game master to have any input whatsoever on the skills that a player collects. Neither is there any limitation to the types of attributes and skills you pick up. Those are totally in the hands of the player, and therefore the player is now in control of his own advancement, and therefore it's self-regulating. And the game master's mechanism has more to do with making the combat scenes exciting and narrating the interactions that come from the dice rolls. So we will go into more of this tomorrow. I wanted to get this episode re-recorded because I didn't get an opportunity to do it this morning. I want to thank you for persisting until the end, and if you like what you're seeing, make sure you follow this channel on Twitch. Also check out our YouTube channel at NycosRPG.com. And for certain, if you want to become a participant in our game sessions, check out our Patreon account at patreon.com/Nycos. And if you become a member of the Patreon at any level, you can join us in our Saturday and Sunday games, which are at 9 a.m. Pacific and 1 p.m. Pacific on Saturday and Sunday, respectively. So I'll give more information on that during the week as we go along. Thank you again for joining us for Creative Differences. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been NycosRPG. We will see you next time.